So hello friends of philosophy. We are still reading Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, the ultimate party animal Hegel, who's always a great conversational topic on any party you attend. And it's always good to be educated on his idea that is very German, namely Hegel's idea of the system. So last time, I just want to start right ahead. I don't want to say much at the beginning as I usually do. So let's just talk about what we have discussed before very briefly. We talked about the two general principles of how everything is constituted, and it is all determined by the notion of development, that everything changes into its opposite or that changes into contradictories. And he explained actually that with regard to the idea of reason that humans have, and especially the idea is characterized by the notion of development, because the idea is the totality of everything we can think. It's everything we can think. So it's the totality of everything that is determinated. And in that sense, it's potentially knowable. We cannot know everything at once. We cannot just pull everything at once into our consciousness. We don't have this godlike mind. But we want to know it. We want to actualize that potential. Hegel has another statement where he argues that if we wouldn't want to actualize it, it wouldn't be a potential because it would never realize itself. So there's an idea of the idea realizing itself, which of course we could question in more detail, but we won't do that now. And so there is a kind of interrelation between the notion of development and the second idea, which is the notion of the concrete. And that is because the idea, which is general and abstract, tries through its activity of actualizing itself always to make itself concrete. So there's always a motion from the absolute to the concrete to unify the differences that it finds. So we have discussed both of these ideas in detail. And we also have discussed the contradictions that emerge from it. And we have discussed several examples where we find these contradictions, and that contradictions are actually not a hindrance for philosophy. And last time we finished with this important sentence: how philosophy is constituted as this determinate system of thoughts that merge into this one idea. Ideally. As concrete, this activity is a succession of processes in development which must be represented not as a straight line drawn out into vague infinity, but as a circle returning within itself, which as periphery has very many circles and whose whole is a large number of processes in development turning back within themselves. So this is just to say that, of course, the idea does not develop forth to something that is outside, and therefore it's like a line of progress where some people would say, well, ultimately we just progress towards reality. No, I think what he says here is that the idea actually progresses towards itself because it wants to actualize its own potential. It wants to actualize itself. And in this sense, it's always bend back towards itself. And this bending back is a circular movement itself, so it's a circle of circle. This is how Hegel wants to understand his system. And that is what I say is a relativism that includes the truth of knowing itself without necessarily progressing towards mind-external reality. So our goal is to know ourselves as reasonable beings to achieve the identity with ourselves. So, and this is what we discuss now under the C section. C section, well, you know what I mean. If we cannot bear the truths naturally, we have to do a C-section. Okay, that's my bad dad humor. So philosophy as the apprehension of the development of the concrete. Having thus generally explained the nature of the concrete, I now add as regards its import that the truth thus determined within itself is impelled towards development. That is what I already tried to argue. I think the argument is not yet very strong. So if you have a better argument, why, or if you understood it better than me, why the truth of the idea is impelled to development, towards development, you can let me know in the comments. That would be certainly very helpful. Nevertheless, he says that there are only two entities who resemble this kind of movement from its internal perspective. It is only the living and spiritual which internally bestirs and develops itself. Thus, the idea as concrete in itself, so it's implicitly concrete, not yet explicitly concrete, and self-developing, is an organic system and a totality which contains a multitude of stages and of moments in development. Now, I don't know whether the reality is finally an organic system, that we have to imagine it like an organism where each part contributes to the whole and thus forms this Gestalt, this form that we see. So, and I don't know if the idea has to be seen in this organic understanding, but definitely we try to understand as if it is an organic system. That's how I would phrase it. And the totality, it's an organic system and a totality which contains a multitude of stages and movements in development. So yeah, I mean, if we look at a plant, for example, the seed is not its final form, and so we can say the truth of the seed is the growing plant, and the truth of the plant is its fruit, while the truth of the fruit may be its seed, while the truth of the seed is a plant again. So here we have stages, while of course the movement of the plant is a repetitive cycle that is external to itself. For humans, he claims that we get into the circle of reason knowing itself and that we determine it internally, so that we self-determine it, what I believe he thinks is an identity and at the same time freedom, because if something determines itself, it does not depend on something else, and therefore it's a freedom from something, and maybe even a freedom for something, but we had to clarify what that means too. So philosophy has now become for itself the apprehension of this development, so the taking together, and as conceiving thought, is itself this development in thought. So this is like philosophy is the subject, at the same time the object. It is the conceiving thought, and it is the thought that is developed, thinking things itself, which is always a very strong subject in Western continental philosophy. The more progress made in this development, the more perfect is the philosophy. So he does not say that we perfect it, but we say we get to higher and higher forms of perfection. This development goes no further out than into externality, but the going without itself of development also is a going inwards. So it spreads out by knowing itself. So here we have again a contradiction. That is to say, the universal idea, universal is usually what is empty and what is thought without the individuals, okay, continues to remain at the foundation and still is the all-embracing and unchangeable. So the universal is in the concrete individual that we observe, which is the particular, but it's also at the same time outside. And how do we have to imagine that? See, when we are humans producing ourselves by getting babies, We participate in the universals of humans. The universal of human. I mean, I'm also a human. I'm as much human as you, my fellow viewers, if there's not an AI that watches us. But like, I participate in the same universal as you. I'm still an individual, though it is unclear what it is that makes the individual in me that is not at the same time maybe a universal. That's a very complicated question in itself. But if I produce an offspring from myself, family member, a daughter or a son, I participate in my universal as another individual, which is crazy if you think about it, or mind-blowing. So, and in that sense, I produce myself externally as another individual, but I'm also at the same time in this other individual. And I think we have to imagine that in a similar way for the idea. I produce myself in the idea through thinking. I produce myself in an individual idea, but at the same time, I produce a universal thought that is individual, this thought, this determined thought. And so I participate in the universal that is outside of me, but at the same time, I'm inside of that universal. That is to say, the universal idea continues to remain at the foundation and still is the all-embracing and unchangeable. So we now had to extend that and say, yeah, the universal idea is the pull towards the development. It is at the beginning and at the same time at the outside. Pretty Aristotelian, if you ask me. While in philosophy, the going out of the idea in course of its development is not a chance, a becoming another, but really is a going within itself, a self-immersion. The progress forward makes the idea, which was previously general and undetermined, determined within itself. So we have like this desire, this unspecified intellectual desire to develop more thoughts and to grasp ourselves, and it's undetermined. And then we make it determined. So we want to go inside instead towards the outside, towards the natural empirical world. I believe that is what he says here. Further development of the idea or its further determination is the same thing exactly. Depth seems to signify intensiveness, but in this case, the most extensive is also the most intensive. The more intensive is the mind, the more extensive is it. Hence, the larger is its embrace. And yeah, I don't want to summarize that again. It's the same contradiction that I tried to explain already. It's coming again and again, and it's Hegel's idea, and we need to go deeper. Extension as development is not dispersion or falling asunder, but a uniting bond, which is the more powerful and intense as the expanse of the embraced is greater in extent and richer. So, okay, we have here extension as development. We develop towards the outside, but it's not a dispersion or like a falling apart. But this extension, because it is motivated by an internal drive and it drives towards the internal at the same time, is a uniting bond, which is the more powerful and intense. So it's more powerful as the expansion because it still keeps it together. Yes, in such a case, what is greater is the strength of opposition and of separation. And the great power overcomes the greater separation. So yeah, this is a little bit cryptic. I guess I could explain that in more detail, but I want to go on. We just want to say here that the identity that reason achieves is bigger than the separation that it must experience at the same time. If that wouldn't be the case, reason would just be falling apart. And why is this bond, this unifying tendency greater than its difference? Because that's the internal drive of the potential to actualize itself. It unfolds itself to unify itself, to be, in that sense. These are the abstract propositions, so we're just talking here about the abstract ideas. maybe I shouldn't say ideas, thoughts, okay? Undetermined, well, thoughts are determined. So maybe proposition is a good translation here. Regarding the nature of the idea and of its development. And thus, within it, philosophy in its developed state is constituted. So what is philosophy? It is one idea in its totality and in all its individual part, like one life in a living being, one pulse throbs throughout all its members. So we have here again the metaphor of an organism, and that's a very bold statement. So Hegel really had to prove that. And this would be something where we would say, well, why do you have to compare it with an organism? And do you claim that the philosophy of history is structured in the same way? Actually, Hegel makes these claims, but Walter Jeschke, the main editor of the Hegel completed works, he says, never really works out. So why does Hegel say that? And he has different hypotheses about that we will discuss in another session. All the parts represented in it and their systematization emanate from the one idea. All these particulars are but the mirrors and copies of this one life and have their actuality only in this unity. So everything that we see with regard to the empirical world or with all thoughts are mirrored in this one idea, while the absolute idea is actually by Hegel already discussed in the science of logic, which I believe he mentioned before, that he said the particulars of this endeavor are laid out in the science of logic. Thus, the idea is the central point, which is also the periphery, the source of light, which in all its expansion does not come without itself, but remains present and immanent within itself. Thus it is both the system of necessity and its own necessity, which also constitutes its freedom. Now, okay, what do we say in this paragraph? We say we have established the abstract idea, the abstract totality of thought, which was the project of the logic, where the idea completely determines itself. But now he says, it's only abstract. So in the sense it is abstract, it is not yet the complete truth. It's partial, it's a torso, it's a notion that he has developed that is very powerful, that we now need to interpret any kind of experience in empirical reality, the reality that is outside, that surrounds us, that is not just in our mind. And he says, this reality is driven by this internal machine that is also in our mind, and we can recognize every phenomenon through it because this is the major drive. So these are very bold statements, and they wouldn't say that Hegel is a relativist because he would say everything in the universe marches along these drawn lines from the logic. Everything develops according to these laws of generation. Now, and this is a very difficult question because it challenges my relativist interpretation, and also it makes Hegel, in a sense, impossible to read because his system is just not applicable to the way of how, for example, history unfolds and develops. So we have to look into that a little bit deeper. My hypothesis is that he says, well, see, with this torso of the logic, which, by the way, he said was an unfinished book, because if Plato has written the Republic 7 times, the logic should have been written at least 77 times. And he has already worked through this book many, many times. So it's an unfinished work, but I believe he says here's a structure that is very powerful, and we can prove that it is actually applicable to the world. But of course, if the world contradicts this idea, we have to also change the system. So I regard Hegel's philosophy as such an experiment to really try to establish a totality of thoughts, but not claiming that it is the final form of thoughts. And so this is actually the ground where we have to get back to the philosophy of history. I think this is why he puts it at the beginning of his introduction. He lays out how he wants to read the philosophy of history. But I think the philosophy of history is not just a practice for fingers, a finger practice, okay? It's not just like a warming up. I think he also accepts that the philosophy of history might reveal new truths, because the philosophy of history is about the truth, as he has said before. I think it completes the logical system. The logical system, as Walter Jeschke also points out, is the foundation, but also not more. Okay, so far some other thoughts on Hegel, a little bit more reading. What do you think? What do you think about Hegel? Is he a relativist or not? Let me know in the comments. Or is it an appealing interpretation that I offer to you? Let me know in the comments too. So far, I thank you very much, and I hope that we see again. If you want to see again, subscribe, give me a like, check out my other channels on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. That would be very nice. And for the rest, I can just say, live long, study even more Hegel, and